Welcome to Fire Service Court Radio. Although we're no longer radio, we are right in your face. You get to see what all of us look like, and that is just not a good thing. So my name is Brad Pinsky, and I guess I'm your host today on whatever we're calling this now. And with me, you have John Murphy, Curt Varone, and the Honorable Chip Comstock. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about something we've been talking about for a very long time. If you have your head in your sand, then you don't know this has been an issue. Maybe it's an issue in your firehouse, maybe not. Maybe you're denying it. But we want to talk. And look, we all know the volunteer fire service is dying a very quick death, and we want to prevent that. We know that it's hard to get people into the fire service generally. Police forces are having a hard time recruiting. So one of the things I really want to suggest and talk about is we look at why is that? And on a legal end, the lawyers actually have an answer. I think, Curt and Chip, I'll say a lot. If you don't fix it, the lawyers are going to come and fix it, right? And we know if you don't fix it, we are going to fix it for you. We're going to correct the wrongs through the court system. And that's not how things should happen. So today, at least at the beginning, let's talk about, and I don't know who has some background noise going on here, but let's talk about sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, discrimination in general in the fire service. And let's be blunt about it, recognize the issue, and then stop it, because you can look at this in a couple of ways, right? You could say, well, I don't care, we don't have a problem. Well, you're probably wrong. You can be very proactive and prevent the problem, but it's hard to believe you absolutely, without looking, have no problem. However, we also could say, well, let the lawyers fix it. If we lose, we lose. Well, that's very expensive in tight taxpayer money times, right? We don't have the money to throw out at all of these things. And, you could say, oh, it's insured. Well, sexual harassment is not really insured. The defense might be, but not the payment. So the lawyers are here to talk to the fire service and the EMS service, frankly, about how to curb this rampant problem of sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, race discrimination, gender discrimination, all of these. And the reason I say this, if you watch on Mondays, you watch Curt and I do our radio show, a different radio show with video. We can't get away from the fact, and if you read Curt's blog, which we've talked about forever, right, Fire Law blog, you cannot get away from the fact that almost every 1 out of 4 cases or so are going to be on harassment or discrimination. And it's always, they paid, they settled, they paid, they settled. So I'm throwing out to you, let's go in order, not by people, of what would be, if you wanted to tell someone the first step to looking to see whether you have an issue, what are the first steps, right? To see, do we have a problem? Should we cure the problem? It's a risk analysis, right? We do it. We pre-plan on fire scenes. We do risk analysis all the time, risk management planning. What's the first step in this risk management planning? I'll turn to Curt. And of course, you're going to have to unmute him. So
I unmute and then it clicked down again. So apparently I should be good now. Okay. So that's a great question. And you kind of, to some extent, I think all of us are kind of like, trying to think it through. But I have very strong opinion on this. And it kind of couples the studies I've been doing in forensic psychology with my experience in the fire service and the law, obviously, the law part of this. It seems to me that we've got people in the fire service kind of on two sides of this issue. One side are people who bully others and harass others because they enjoy it. And I think that's one side. And I think often people tend to assume that that's the problem. And maybe it is the problem in certain scenarios, but not in my experience. Okay, I think most firefighters are adults. They're well-adjusted. They like their pranks. They like their jokes, but nothing over the top. Okay, that they understand the limits. On the other side, we have people who have a lifelong victimology approach to life. And they might have some personality issues, a difficult personality. They may also have some competency issues. And what I see is that, and I would love, if I was going to get a PhD in psychology, this is the area I would like to study, because what percentage of our problems are coming from disordered perpetrators versus which are coming from disordered victims, and they're perceiving things that happen in a certain way. So irrespective of that, the one thing that I would advise our firefighters is there is no justification for harassing someone because of their competency or because they have a difficult personality. That we have to clean up our workspace with the jokes, with a lot of the things. We cannot be going in certain directions, gender-oriented directions, race-oriented directions, with jokes, with pranks, with other things. That we've got to get serious. And here's sort of the hardest thing for firefighters, I think, to accept is that we've got to desexualize the workplace. That we have a station on Monday where it's all males and the conversation is kind of like a locker room. And then on Tuesday, there happens to be one female working. When we haven't desexualized the workplace, we create a scenario where a person with a competency issue, again, pick your protected class. You have someone with a personality disorder or somebody difficult personality or incompetent. When they're struggling, they're going to say, oh, it's because of all those jokes. Oh, it's because of all those pranks. Oh, it's because of this, that, and the other thing. It's not me. I'm wonderful. I'm God's gift to my fire department. It's not me. It's all these other people. And I think we've got to recognize we've got to clean up our act. And we can't just clean it up on Tuesday when there's a certain person in the station. We've got to clean it up on Monday, right on through the rest of the week. So that would be my advice. That's what we need to do.
Awesome. And John, what would your first steps be? Nope. Mute. You're on mute. Still mute. John, your words are wisdom, but we can't hear them. And by the way, while John's trying to figure out his mute button, I will say you missed the blue attire. So we had a memo this morning. We're all in blue.
Curt did it. Pop back.
You click it, and then you step away from the click.
You guys are hammering me from my cell phone the last time.
Anyway, what would your first steps be, John?
So while our newly minted psychologist was speaking about the desexualization of fire stations, I think is a good idea. I was just looking at the survey that FDNY did on discrimination and race issues, and with the new Commissioner Kavanaugh apparently is trying to set lots of different new standards, which really irritates a lot of the old guard firefighters. But I think a couple of key things that popped out of that survey that was done is, first of all, FDNY is the largest department in our country. And so on a survey that responded, they got 4,000 respondents, which is significant in a survey, right? Indicated a couple of key things. One, I think there's a enculturation of the sort of this discrimination, harassment, the good old boy network. This is the way we've always done it. This is our fire department. You don't belong here because you're a woman, or you're not competent, or you're black, or you're a lesbian or a gay, and we're going to do everything we can to get you out of here. The second was that even if they did, they had the policies, which we've always talked about, that you need to have good, workable, enforceable policies. A lot of the aggrieved employees don't report because I think, and the impression I get out of the survey is that there's no action taken. And so if you're a firefighter and you're getting harassed, you go to your lieutenant or your captain says, tough shit, pardon my French, but we're not doing anything about it. It's just the way it is here in Station 27. And if you go to the battalion chief or the assistant chief, it still is this sort of, we're not going to do anything. You're a horrible employee. There's been all these reports that have been done, and that it is just the nature of the fire service to engage in these sort of activities. I think there's one, not one, probably several, but I think there's a recent either pending litigation where a firefighter who's black sues the department, and then he sues the diversity officer for retaliation and those sorts of things. And I think what I'm beginning to see, and we've seen this and talked about it, is that if the top management does not enforce these policies and try to change the culture of the organization, then we're going to have this sort of rampant continuing discrimination that goes on in our fire service. And I know
John,
that Congress and the president, current president, has signed. Say again.
I just wanted to kind of follow on what you're saying, and because it's exactly, you're saying exactly what I was saying. You're saying it differently, okay? But I want to explain why those company officers are not reporting it. They're not reporting it because they don't believe there's actual harassment going on. They think that the employee has a personality disorder, or they're a problem employee, or the person has competency issues. Right. And that they're using harassment and their protected class as an excuse. And that's why the company officers are not reporting it. And I think you're absolutely right. The company officers have got to treat it, even though they think it's a bogus claim, and it may very well be a bogus claim, it still needs to be investigated, because by not investigating it, they're compounding the problem. Okay. And roughly 1 out of 10 people right. has a personality disorder by the numbers that I've seen. And so you're talking about and this is not limited to white people or African Americans, or it's one of the most consistent statistics across psychology. And so that pick your protected class, 1 out of 10 is going to have a personality disorder, and that's going to cause them to perceive things that might actually not be harassment to be harassment. Okay. On the other side, it could be someone who's doing the harassment, like you said, that someone who's going to actually go to someone and say, we don't accept you because you're a lesbian. We don't accept you because you're gay, or whatever it may be. That person could be a person with a personality disorder. Okay. So you can't get away from this issue. We need to upgrade our training for our company officers to recognize this and to not follow the easy path, which is to just tell the person, look, you're not cutting it here, and therefore you've got to put up with this harassment, and say, no, okay, you're making a complaint. We're going to do it right. We're going to handle it. We're going to do an investigation. And then if the investigation is unfounded, well, then you're going to have to deal with it. But we are going to do the investigation. That's from this is not statistical, my personal experience. That's happening more than someone actually being harassed. And it's not to say people aren't being harassed. They are being harassed. But what percentage of it is which? That's the undetermined question.
So just kind of finishing out that, and I can appreciate that. I just want to finish out my thought process here. I think that, so the question is, do we do more training? So there's diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Do we do more communication training? Can we talk to each other better? And then how do we bring new people into the organization with all of the, after the condition of employment letter or conditional employment, psychological exam, physical, all that sort of stuff. Where in the psychological component of it is, are you a good play in the sandbox with everybody else without creating unnecessary disruption?
Speaking of unnecessary destruction, Chip.
Well, first of all, my first reaction was everybody in the fire service has some degree of mental illness. I mean, it's just a matter of degree, right? I mean, the regular folk on the street aren't attracted to what we're attracted to. So I've always said that everybody's a little off kilter, but we have a certain acceptable amount of mental illness, and then we have the stuff we have to deal with. And my next thought was that the people who need to hear the sermons are never in church. And here we are going to talk about this, and the people that Curt are talking about are going to be the folks who are really going to be resistant to addressing head on these very issues. And so the question is, how do we provide that to the troops, to the supervisors, in a meaningful way that's going to have an impact and actually make a difference? And I think that's part of the secret. But I'm going to go even further back. I get, one of the questions: how do we identify an issue or a problem? And I was thinking, if you're in charge of the department, again, this is where I struggle, because I think the people who have the problems are so totally unaware of it and don't do anything. But if you're head of a department, whether it's a small volunteer department or a larger department, the first question is: does your department reflect the community? Is there a reason why we don't have any women or we don't have any minorities, particularly when our community is made up of minorities? And that might suggest that you have some sort of systemic problem that needs to be addressed, where people either aren't joining or people are leaving, and you need to take a look at that. And sometimes it takes those internal questionnaires by, like the city's doing, to find out what is the culture, because often the folks at the top who have the best ability to make those changes are oblivious to what's going on down, on the streets. And I think that can be a problem. It's maybe it's easier to gauge in a smaller department, but I think even the small volunteer departments, that's the way we've always done it. This is, we look around and we've had these discussions before about, things like recruiting, what does your department look like? How are you recruiting these people, and recruiting your potential firefighters, and are they leaving, and if they're leaving, why? And at the end of the day, the fire department has to be inclusive in the sense that we have to treat everybody with respect. I mean, it's really a basic premise, right? In life, treat other people with respect and with decency, and people will get along. But unfortunately, we seem to have our share of problem, I'll call them problem personnel, that, again, going down Curt's scenario, that we have to deal with and find a way to deal with those folks. So that's my gauge, is looking around right from the beginning. And I think if you don't see a diverse fire department, then you've probably got some issues that need to be dealt with. So anyways.
I was having this discussion at DIC with a firefighter, fairly well-known firefighter who I definitely won't mention. And the individual, I said, do you think there's a harassment problem in the firehouse and discrimination problem? He said, of course there is. He said, because some people shouldn't be doing the job. And, at first I was like, oh, how could you say that? But on the other hand, let's go back to our very basic principles of Maslow, right? Maslow's second hierarchy of needs contains safety. We have to feel safe. And not to get too far off point, but I was looking at a presentation, which I believe the three of you plus Dr. Beth gave in my conference a very long time ago, on bullying and harassment. And one of the studies that you all referenced on bullying, and again, somebody has, background noise. One of the studies you referenced in bullying was that there is actually both a reason for bullying and a benefit for bullying, right? We believe that if we put you through this harassment and bullying torture scenario and you survive it, that we now welcome you into the club. Forget whether you're, of any protected class or anything, just whoever you are, we put you through this harassment and bullying diatribe and you survive it, you're welcomed in. And we trust you, right? We believe that you're strong enough, mentally strong enough to do the job of firefighting. And I think there is definitely some of that why sexual harassment and other types of discrimination harassment continue, because we believe that the big, strong male is the safest male. And I always laugh because I'm 5'6", right? And 135 pounds wet. And yet I'm always the one who got told, well, you crawl under the car, or you crawl through the wall, or you go up on the roof because you're not heavy enough. I'm like, okay, well, we use the small guy and small person more than anybody else because the big guys can't fit places.
What they didn't come out right out and say is, Brad, you're expendable.
Right. I always wondered where everybody was when I finally made myself out. In any event, so I think there is a safety component. So I'm not justifying any harassment or discrimination, but I want to recognize the mentality that causes it. Because, this firefighter said to me, he said, listen, he said, 110-pound female's not going to pull me out. And I said to him, am I okay to be in the service? He's like, yeah. I said, I'm 130 pounds, 5'6". I'm not, it doesn't make sense.
Isn't it though? What we're talking about is if you can have drills, training, whatever, that's actually reflective of the job duties, that's okay. And we're saying this is a drill that accurately reflects, or this is training that accurately reflects what we have to do. And whoever's going to do it, regardless of gender, race, whatever, that's it. And it actually reflects the job. It's when people are putting people in positions that doesn't reflect the job that the problems come up.
So isn't that one of the first steps? Create accurate job duties. Create your essential job performance requirements, right? Define the job that reflects the why, not the who.
The interesting thing, I think I was at that there when you had that particular conversation, and one of the things we talked about is within a fire department, and particularly a larger department, right? You may have different job duties as a person who's on an engine versus a truck versus somebody on the rescue, right? And what they may have to do, and the as opposed to a department where you have to do everything. And so in some departments, we may say, look, the job qualifications for this job are different than this job, and we can accurately show that's truthful, right? I mean, we're not just making stuff up. And I think one of the examples was, is there a difference between a cook in the Army and somebody who's got to be on a SEAL team, right? Or different job duties and performance standards.
Mm-hmm. So, John, one of the things that you you speak on a lot of issues, obviously, but, one of the focuses that you've had a lot is training, right? And training officer liability, et cetera. And the training officer, and there's a reason I bring this up, is normally the first person you meet in your way into the academy, your way into the fire service, right? The training officer is your welcome person. You don't deal with the chief. You don't deal with lieutenants and everybody else. You're going through training. Is there a role for the training officer to be providing because think about it, Curt and I discussed a while ago a big lawsuit and at the fire academy. And I think 10 years ago, wasn't there, John, you had spoken on a long time ago, like a $20 million settlement at a training academy in Texas, or some huge number. And I'm just curious what the training officer could do. Because to me, that's where we're seeing a lot of, right, probationary firefighters, they're trying to cut them out right there. Maybe the training officer could have a role in this evaluation. And I'm not saying, let's protect everybody just because for the sake of protecting them. If they can meet the minimum job requirements, shouldn't we be protecting them? And if they can't, I don't know whether we get rid of them or help them get to the minimum requirements. But how is the training officer into this, especially at academies, John? And somebody's got something really loud and beach-like going on in the back.
Well, I think that part of this, can you hear me? See myself. I want to see that. So I think that the question is a great question. So I think that, yes, the training officer is the person that you see the most, or their delegates, right? So if you're in an academy, I think you're teaching them the basic skills of, what our job is all about. And so as a training officer and your delegates need to know what that job is, and then relay accurately to, your probationary, your recruits what that is. I think I just read the article that David Rhodes wrote in Fire Engineering Magazine about trying to meet, because we're seeing a different caliber, I think, of recruits coming in, according to everybody who's making those sort of observations, is that they may, and the thought is, they may be lacking the essential skills of, for an example, tools. And I've used that reference before. And so in David Rhodes's article, he says, the bottom line is we need to meet the recruit where they are. And I think that's an admirable goal. But the other part of it is that, we have them to perform certain functions and learn certain skills. And so at the end of an academy, they either pass or they don't pass. And I think we have a tendency to become somewhat reluctant to fail people out of a recruit academy because the intent is we spend a lot of money getting them there. Let's see if we can train them to at least make it to the end of their first year on probation. And so, and then the other part is, and then you put people out on probation, and then it gets into what Curt talks about is that there's this sort of illusion that they're incompetent, right? Or there's an illusion that, whatever, then that is the remainder of the department that becomes the de facto training officer when these young firefighters, middle-aged firefighters now, become part of your organization. Going back to what Chip was talking about volunteers, is that I just wanted to say that I think we need to be honest with our volunteers as to exactly what they're getting into when they come into our department. Because I think what we do is we put this illusion on that we're like, rushing down the street in a fire engine with red lights and siren, we're going to save everybody's life. But the reality is, it's boring, right? So there's days and hours and months and years of all of a sudden this sheer terror because now we have a big house fire or a plane crash or a truck accident or a rescue or those sorts of things. And so we need to sort of take the volunteer side and say, look, providers, we do a lot of different things in our community, and fighting fires and rescuing people may not be that, that sort of primary focus in our organization. And then I think we need to sort of set our training standards to meet what the response needs are in your community and the people that you have available to do that.
So, Curt, I want to turn to you for a second because you said something. I don't want to ignore that there are toxic people, right? And I don't know whether we like that phrase or not, but there are definitely people who have all through their lives, go through their life blaming other people for their failures. And we definitely see that in the fire service. So I don't want to jump on, as you perfectly did, there are two sides to this story, right? There's the people who harass and the people who perceive that no matter what happens to them as harassment is unjustified. So let's talk about how should we deal with the people who really are of the problem and not put the department in a position legally where we can't defend our decisions. How do we best defend and prepare for our decisions against those people who really are problems?
Yeah, and that's, I thought John was going to go there. He started to go there, but when we have those people in the academy, that's where we want to try to identify them. And there's a case, I believe it's Allen versus Denver. City of Denver Fire Department was decided last year. And Brad, you and I have spoken on the case. Excellent case. It's like a textbook for how a fire department needs to handle somebody with either personality or competency issues. How do you document it? And what you don't want to have is drill instructors who are going to behave like Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket, because that's a recipe for creating liability unnecessarily. And that's one of the, I think, the lessons that we need to work on our instructor corps and our administration as well, that kind of thing just sets up, and there goes John, that sets up, yeah. But it sets up the department for a big problem. And the person could be totally incompetent. The person could be just a disaster as a person. But when you have that kind of Sergeant Hartman kind of mentality in your instructor corps, you're like handing them, it's like teeing up the golf ball for the person to on a sexual harassment or gender discrimination or race discrimination or religious discrimination or military discrimination or you name it. So we've got to train up our officer corps to recognize this problem. And it's not all that easy. And I want to go back to something else, too. Hopefully I answered that part of your question, but it has to do with the harassment or what may be perceived as pranks and jokes and things happening in the fire service. And Chip kind of alluded to this. There are people that want to eliminate any sort of humor in the firehouse. That anything that's funny, any joke, anything has the potential to create liability for yourself or for your organization. So they want to kind of just, this is a workplace and there should be no joking around and that kind of stuff. That is crap. That is absolute crap. And we've got to call that out. One of the classes I took was a course. It was an elective, but it's really, really good class. It was called Positive Psychology. And we learned about, most psychology looks at illness, mental illness, addictions, and different things. So most psychology is, looking at what's broken and how do we fix it. Positive psychology looks at what do healthy people do. And it looks at kind of on the positive side. And one of the therapies, you're not going to believe this, okay, but one of the therapies that we learned about in positive psychology is a thing called humor therapy. Okay, and this is, fairly last 20, 30 years, there's been...
Well, I go out drinking with Chip.
And that's why, if you have a friend that is full of jokes and things, that's why you enjoy being with them. Okay, but at any rate, humor therapy, very, very important. Okay, and it's been used in a lot of different things, depression, anxiety, a lot of different things. But you know what? The number one of the best, one of the best uses of humor therapy. Take a guess. What is one of the biggest psychological problems that we have in the fire service? What would you think?
Bullying? I mean,
well, think about it. Think about what's, what when you think about psychological problems. PTSD, humor therapy. Humor therapy is a phenomenal treatment for PTSD. And the fire service is, without knowing it, we've had humor in our fire service for centuries.
One of the things that I always think about as an example from TV was MASH, right? The show MASH, where here you are in hell dealing with death on a regular basis, and here's two doctors that are just clowning around all the time, and and making people laugh and doing stuff that didn't really hurt anybody. And again, I always use that as a great example of a really crappy situation where people made light of it and help them get through it.
Yeah.
And one of the types of humor that I think we see in the fire service a lot, and probably everywhere a lot, but is degrading therapy, right? Or degrading humor. We isolate somebody, we make fun of them. My God, if you're the person, and think about this, because I'm thinking about what you're saying, we should bring Dr. Beth in, but all the psychology in the fire service, if how many of us are afraid to make the mistake, right? My God, you make a mistake on scene or a training, you'll never hear from it. You make a bad call, right, on a fire, you're never going to hear the end of this. So people are terrified, I would think, to make a mistake. They maybe detract or deflect the fact that they made a mistake or have some incompetencies by picking on others or bullying others or pointing out the weakest link. It's not me, it's her, it's them. So you're right. I mean, the psychology in the firehouse, which would be a great FDIC topic, people. The psychology in the fire service that leads to all of this is never spoken of, right? I mean, I think you're just opening up an amazingly interesting topic.
Yeah.
But, and part of it is being able to identify what the people are. And I'm going to use myself as an example. I remember a call that I went to grab an extinguisher out of my command vehicle. Didn't realize that the pin was out. So as I pulled it out, the thing went off all over.
I'm sure no one ever said anything to you about it, right?
No. And that was probably 10 years ago, and every once in a while I hear, hey, watch, using the extinguisher. But, the thing is for me, listen, I did it. It was funny, and people give me a hard time. And I guess with my background in the job we all do, doesn't bother me at all. But other people have more of a sensitivity, right? We talk about being able to identify those people who they being made fun of or giving that hard time, they'd feel really bad. It'd have a much different impact. And so some things we then say, well, let's treat everybody like they're hypersensitive, and don't say anything, and don't ever kid anybody, and don't go that path. And sometimes what it comes down to, and again, this is from a supervisor, chief, fellow firefighters, is know your people, right? If you really know the folks, you know that, hey, you give Chip crap and he doesn't care. Other people, you have to understand that person, because of whatever issues, may have to be addressed a little differently. And so I think you have to be sensitive to how you, again, getting back to just being a little bit kind with people, understanding them, get to know them. And that goes a long way.
Chip, so I have a question for all of you.
Well, let me throw one thing out, because I use this in my class. We have Mrs. Smith lives in a building that's a concrete building, looks very much like our burn buildings. Mrs. Jones lives in a lightweight wood truss building. Okay, we have an obligation to both of them to provide a service. We're not going to say, oh, we're not going in Mrs. Jones's house, or we're not going in, but the reality is we can do things in Mrs. Smith's house, the fire resistant building, that we can't take a chance on in Mrs. And you know what? Every firefighter who's competent knows the difference, knows how important building construction is. Well, guess what? There are people who are the equivalent of a lightweight wood truss building. And we need to train our officer corps up to the point where they can recognize them. And just like Chip said, it's not that we're going to discriminate against them. We're not discriminating against Mrs. Jones because she lives in a lightweight wood truss building, but we recognize it. We have to handle it differently.
So let me ask this, and tell me whether, I want to throw out a couple scenarios, and maybe we can come up with more of them, about whether this is discrimination or not. A female firefighter, Jesus, hi John, a female firefighter forgets the tools, right, when she goes to the front door.
Yeah. Forgets
the tool, shows up at the front door, and the guy's like, well, you're the iron person, where the hell are they, right? Mm-hmm. And as a punishment / training, for the next week, that individual has to carry around a set of irons all through the firehouse 24/7. Discriminatory or not?
Stupid, yes. Childish, yes.
Does it prove a point? Make a point?
Absolutely. But again, it just, like, why go there? Like, why go there? And if the person is well adjusted, and all of us, none of us are perfect. Okay. We make mistakes. If the person's well adjusted, they're going to be able to learn from the mistake and say, oh, damn, I got to remember to do that. They don't have to be treated like a 2-year-old. Okay. So that right there solves the liability aspect of it. Now, if the officer recognizes that this person is a little bit of a concern, their personality, I'm not sure that they can handle that, we're not going to do that. You're asking that officer to make that kind of a determination. But I think it's not going to be one thing that one incident that's going to lead to liability. But that, coupled with several other examples, could in fact make a case for discrimination. I think I would never do something like that.
I think that example shows me the stupidity of how you treat people. And my answer is, listen, people don't like to make mistakes. And I would look at that person after a call and say, what did you do that you could have done better? Well, I forgot my irons. Why did you forget your irons? Because this was going on, I got distracted. Okay, fine. They're not going to make, if they forget the irons 4 more times, and we better figure out what that is. Mm-hmm. But the fact that a person makes a single mistake, like Curt said, we all make mistakes. As long as you recognize it, you improve it, you don't repeat it, end of story.
But is it illegal? And Curt will know where I'm going in a minute, but is it illegal?
It's not illegal unless I had the female do that, but when the guy did it, I let him go.
Right. And there's a perception aspect here as well. One difference, one of the classes that I do is on liability. I actually have a timeline, and I have the lawyer's timeline. And when we're talking about an apparatus accident, or we screw up on a medical run, it's like one thing happens, and then we're going to have a lawsuit. So that's kind of like the lawyer's timeline for an accident or whatever. When it comes to HR, what we actually have is we have that timeline, but there's going to be a series of things that actually show a series of dominoes. And there's going to be a series of things that happen. And that's good news for company officers because you can make some mistakes. It's not going to be just one thing. Like an apparatus accident, one thing it's going to lead to the accident, the lawsuit. But there's going to be a series of things that happen that's going to lead to a lawsuit in an HR case. This could be a very big domino in that domino progression. But there's got to be a series of things in order to create that severe or pervasive hostile work environment.
So there was a case, Curt and I did it on the radio show, and this is why I brought up the irons case. So in that case, and Curt, you should, if you remember, and you have a crazy memory for this stuff, instead of the irons, it was somebody forgot to put their gear back. And right at the end of the shift, what they did is they flew it up the flagpole.
All right.
Right.
Yeah.
And they said they would do it to anybody. They would do it to anybody. So the reason I'm bringing this up, and I want to ask if that's okay, because on its own, maybe it is, Curt, right? But it's going to be used in a series of things you did to me or whatever I am, right? To say, look how you're treating me. And your defense is we treat everybody like shit. That's what we see in these cases.
And it can work. I'm not saying it's, if you do it to everybody, but the problem is that person's perception is going to be different. It could be different. Again, if they live in a lightweight wood truss building, I mean, that's their mindset is I'm the victim and, they're going to perceive it in a certain way. And I think it's an unnecessary risk of creating liability. Why do you need to do that?
So, so John, for as long as you're going to be with us now, what I don't want people to see her and look at the lawyers and say, we're just ruining the fire service, right? Because lawyers, frankly, we could be making the fire service better.
We should,
right? I mean, we really could. But are jokes, is harassment, is any of it acceptable in the fire service? Or are we saying never again, right? We're not going to teach people. Because in the Marines, it seems to me, if you leave your rifle somewhere, you're probably carrying it with you and sleeping with it, right? I'm just assuming. I don't know, we can ask Chip's kids, but I don't have a problem with teaching people, reinforcing lessons when they're not based on, well, you're female, I'll treat you one way, you're male, I'll treat you another. But I don't personally want to get rid of all of this. I wouldn't fly someone's gear up the flagpole like they did. But what are we saying, John? Get rid of all jokes in the fire service? Or is that where we are, that we just have to? I might not ask John any more questions anymore.
So I think that, part of this is that it's backwards. I can't say that. There you go. Donate to John's computer.
Great for all of us.
So I think one of the things that we see,
no fun. We can't be making jokes.
See, John's
going to feel bad.
Oh my God. All right. So,
he's going to sue fire engineering.
I'm sensitive. So the issue, I think, is that we have all kinds of personalities that come into the fire service. I know that when we came in, most of us older guys, and we had fairly, I think, thick skins. So we did a lot of pranking, we joked, we did a lot of stuff, but sometimes it became beyond the pale, right? Mm-hmm. So was it offensive? Was it sexually harassing? Was it, all of the things that we have talked about in the past? And I think part of it dictates that we sort of continue this sort of like pranking, or not so much hazing, but the things that we find that are maybe funny to everybody may not be funny to everybody. So if you have 10 guys on your squad and 9 of them are laughing and one of them's looking at you like you're some sort of a crazy person, or I'm offended, then when do you stop doing that stuff in the firehouse? And I think what happens is family, but sometimes we say, we don't even treat our family members that way. Why are we treating our fellow firefighters that way? So I think that, we need to kind of take the temperature of the culture today, as opposed to what it was when we came into the fire service in the 1800s, is that it's different, right? So as an officer or as a firefighter, we need to recognize the fact that, not everybody is like us, and people have different upbringings and backgrounds, and that we need to kind of temper our joking in the fire department or joking in your fire station to probably what's morally or socially acceptable today, which may be in some cases pretty damn boring, actually. So, and I think part of the memory of the firehouse is the pranks that were pulled on us. So, there's really no good answer, I don't think, that satisfies everyone who may be residing or part of your organization in the fire department.
But one of the things you just said is so important in the psychology, going back to Curt, but in the psychology of understanding this, because we want people who are like us. Again, going back to Maslow's safety hierarchy, we want people who are like us. We want people who understand the mission like we do. Why? Because I feel safer. I feel better on scene, that we're of the same mind, that we're not, right? That you're not going to go freelance, or you're going to be there for me when I need to be rescued. We like that of the same mind mentality, do we not? Isn't that what leads to a lot of this harassment and bullying, and we want to weed you out, or we want to make sure you're tough enough for us? I mean, is there anything legally wrong with that mentality, or is that what gets us into trouble?
I think it's a liability risk, an unnecessary liability risk when you go beyond, like John said, beyond the pale.
Yeah, I mean, why do we? Let me throw this out. Why do firefighters have to have good senses of humor? I mean, in truth, statistically, we are 4 lawyers with a great sense of humor and one who's on the verge of a restraining order. But I won't say that is. But why is that everyone who comes into the fire service has to be able to take jokes, give jokes, take crap, give crap, right? Why is that? There's no other job other than maybe a stand-up comedian why you have to be like that. Yet that is the requirement. You must fit in. You must be homogenous like us. You must look like us, joke like us, talk like us. And that's our definition. If we like you, now you're good. You fit in, right? But why do we have to be like that? I think there's an answer. And I think part of the answer is we work in team-like environments. NFPA 1582, when they talk about the physical and mental abilities, they say must be able to work in a team-like atmosphere under stressful conditions. Well, we recognize in 1582 that you have to be able to work in a team-like atmosphere. So is that what it is? You're not part of the team if you don't joke like us, you don't do things like us?
I think we've been self-medicating with humor for centuries. I think that's part of it, that we've been self-medicating. And the fact that humor is now used as a therapy, that if you have PTSD or you have depression or some of the other conditions, that depending on the treating psychologist or psychiatrist, they may use humor therapy to help you, and that it's proven to be effective. We've been self-medicating. And I think that we know that, and people who can't use it, they're perceived as being a little bit off.
I was going to say, I don't care about your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, religion, but I really do want you to have a sense of humor. Yeah. Right? It makes my life a lot more enjoyable if you can joke, and not everybody's like that, but you're going to have to understand the psychology of those folks. But I guess when I look at myself and I have to choose who I want to be around, I want somebody who's going to have a great sense of humor. That would be one of my requirements for all the reasons that Curt has described.
So stay with it, Chip. Is that a legal defense, though? Judge, the humor, the joking, the pranks, the bullying are an important part of the fire service because we work in a team-like atmosphere, and that's why we do it. It's not personal.
It's separate out sense of humor from bullying or jokes. Again, we sit here and kid each other, and I enjoy the sense of humor. I don't necessarily view malicious pranks as humor.
There you go. And isn't that really it? There needs to be a line. That's where think I've been trying to get us all to in the end of this is we're not saying as lawyers, stop joking. What we are saying is recognize when it goes too far, and there needs to be somebody who does that. It can't be the person who's judging themselves, right? To say, it's like the safety officer, right? We're not all in charge of our own safety. I'm coming to you, John. We're not in charge of our own safety. I mean, we are, but the safety officer is kind of that third voice. And maybe we need that humor safety officer in the fire service to say you've gone too far. Now, that should be the lieutenant and the captain. When I became lieutenant and captain, I said, well, I guess I'm no one's friend anymore. And I really meant that. And I learned that from somebody. There's no more joking. So, John.
So I think the humor is a part of our culture anyway, right? So we laugh, we tell jokes, we go to shows, that sort of stuff. We engage, at all levels, not only in the firehouse, but I think humor is our sort of safety net sometimes. So when we can't see the seriousness of what the issue is, or we have a hard time formulating sort of how that fits into our wheelhouse, then I think we create jokes about it. And so some of them are pretty bad, pretty off color, or they're the dark humor that we talk about, and some of it, is actually pretty funny that happens to the people that we. So I think humor is an important element in our in the fire station.
So I we're at like 53 minutes or so. We're getting kind of to the point of wrapping up, but I really want to focus on, okay, so where do we start? Where do we start if you're just watching this and you say, okay, so what do I do? Do I evaluate? Do I survey? Do I write policies? Do I jump to training? Do I just ignore it? Do I ask people, do we have a problem? What's our first steps where people should change their fire department, look at their fire department? We'll go in a circle and use these as kind of closing notes. So starting at least on my top left with Curt.
Yeah, I think we've got to train our officer corps. And, whenever you talk about training, you've got to have curriculum development. So that, I guess, is where you start. But we've got to train our officer corps to recognize, and I use the metaphor of a lightweight wood truss building, to recognize that not every employee is the same. 9 out of our 10 employees are going to be like that fire-resistant building. And they're going to be able to handle the jokes, handle the things, the ups and the downs of the job. 1 out of 10 there is going to, potentially misinterpret things, and not intentionally. This is not about anybody being malicious in what they do. It may appear to be that they're malicious, but they're not. But we've got to recognize that, and that we need our officers to intervene, whether that 1 out of 10 party is being a bully or being the perpetrator of over-the-top pranks and jokes and that kind of thing, or they're the victim, and they're claiming to be the victim and taking that victim stance. One of the good things about it is that you should be able to see this in the person. If you're paying attention, you see it, because it's not new. This has been part of their personality probably since they were about 5 years old. So it probably carried them through. One of the reasons why I am intimately familiar with this is I look at lawsuits. And when I see a firefighter in a magazine or newspaper or online that has been involved in a lawsuit, I try to get a copy of the lawsuit. When I search their name in the legal database, I see that they filed lawsuits before they became firefighters. They maybe filed 2 or 3 lawsuits while they were firefighters. Now that they've left, they're involved in a bunch of different legal proceedings as well. And now they're suing the fire department because they either quit or they were fired or whatever it may be. These people have had sort of lifelong problems, either as bullies or as victims, either side. And that we've got to get our company officer corps trained up to the point where they can recognize the problem employee and not further discriminate against them. On the contrary, we've got to realize that we've got to customize our leadership to them, to their needs. And certainly the chief officers then who are going to handle it also got to be up to the task as well.
It's interesting. You said, I'm going to turn to John next, but one of the things you said is what I'm aware of back from the bullying lecture you guys gave a long time ago is there's 3 stages to becoming a bully. The first is you're bullied. The second is you're the bystander watching other people be bullied to see what you went through, but you see the indoctrination. And then the third stage is, okay, now you're the bully. Now you're in charge of continuing that ritual. So right? This is a lifelong problem that we have.
Yeah, and one point on bullying I would make: I have yet to meet someone who says yes, I was bullying. Now, maybe years afterwards, yes, but in the moment, no bully thinks they're a bully, and that in and of itself says we're dealing with people who have an issue that the 4 of us looking at a fact pattern can say that was clearly bullying. This person doesn't see it.
John, closing up.
I think that this is probably one of the best shows we've ever done. I think we've ranged from volunteers to. I know it. I keep blanking out. I'm checking my line speed. I'm right.
That's why it was so good.
I think it's, and even Chip holding up his little prop there backwards. I thought that was pretty good too. So
you have no idea, John.
I think Chip said it right. The people that are supposed to be here aren't here, right? They're not going to listen to the show. And so we can make a change. So let me paraphrase this. Does a lawsuit change the fire service? And I would say not really. I think what happens is when we take a look at the litigation that goes on, people don't learn from other people's mistakes, right? So if you have a harassment claim or you got a discrimination claim or a wrongful hire or promotional issue, there are certain steps that are brought out in court that, the department failed to follow. And so would an astute fire chief or an astute fire commissioner or officer take a look at the case law that, is, liberally placed on Curt Varone's blog, which is, my students use you all the time as a reference, a resource when they're writing papers. Are they learning the lessons that are brought up? So I think in a global sense, litigation really doesn't change a hell of a lot, right? I think what it does, it changes a moment in time for that fire department and enriches people. And then does the department go on and heal itself, or does it, improve performances? And sometimes you see multiple litigations in the same department because they just don't learn it, right? And so I think that one of the things that we are trying to do as attorneys and humorists and psychologists is to improve the conditions of firefighters and the fire service in general. And by, doing these classes and lectures and writing papers and whatnot, the question is, are we reaching the right audiences? And I'm not so convinced that's the case. So the question is, what's the answer? How do we improve the fire service through, legal maneuvers or challenges to the system, or how do we improve the entry of firefighters coming in, and how do they, come in healthy mentally and physically? And I think that, these shows are probably a microcosm of trying to improve the conditions of the fire service.
Chip, speaking of
All right.
microcosms.
So,
Thanks, John.
I running down just a list. I thought about the fact that, starting off from a general premise was we need to, thinking overall, I think we talked about at the beginning, or I mentioned about increasing the diversity in the workforce and having that reflect our communities, which I think is important. But when we do that, we tend to increase the number of protected classes, which then set us up for those potential claims where people are going to use their protected class status as a crutch, or again, somebody's going to use that as a target. I think it was interesting with Curt talking about prior lawsuits. Background checks may be part of that we need to consider. What is the person's litigation history? Regardless, we're still going to have some folks come into the fire service that we're going to have to deal with. And in that case, there should be a policy in place that deals with harassment. The policy doesn't do us any good unless we educate our officers, our supervisors on how to utilize it, how to enforce it, how to manage it. We need to take surveys on occasion. Brad mentioned that because we need to know whether we're being successful or not. We train our officers, but that doesn't gauge whether or not it's being effective. So we need to know, we just can't educate them. We need to know, is it working? Or are the revisions that we have to make to that? And at the end of the day, I get back to the point I've tried to make throughout this, which I think goes hand in hand with what we've talked about in terms of gauging different people, is you have to know your people. If you're a supervisor, you have to know what works, what motivates, what turns people on and off, what's going to help them succeed. And if you don't pay attention to that, if you don't really take care about your folks and you're just there to do your job, you're going to have problems. So that's my 2 cents.
I guess I'll end by saying, I really do believe that lawsuits change the environment. Look at DEC environmental lawsuits. I mean, there are so many lawsuits that do have a impact. I look back to Billy Goldfeder and firefighter close calls and all these. We almost need to start adding lawsuit issues to firefighter close calls. We have a lot of them, but when we start to rip the Band-Aid off and reveal the problems, like Curt does with loss, Statter 911, firefighter close calls, all these things start to recognize and say it's okay to talk about a problem. That's really why I go back to firefighter close calls, right? It's okay to talk about crap. I almost really killed somebody, right? I almost screwed up. So we can recognize the safety issues. Well, this is a safety issue. And, I keep going back to Nicole Mittendorf, who took her own life after being bullied and winning a lawsuit on bullying and harassment. She wins the lawsuit and she still takes her own life, to see what these things do. And I hope that, I think my final comments, I hope that these lawsuits, don't happen, but they're going to happen because we're not going to stop quitting our pushing things to the limit, pushing our jokes and our comments and whatever to the limit. We're not going to do that. And we're not going to stop doing that. And I recognize there's good reasons to bully and harass and joke. I understand the validity to the rationale to do that, makes you one of our team members, et cetera. But on the other hand, it has life-ending ramifications, right? The Nicole Mittendorfs, the people who are going to take their own lives. We don't need, and this is where I end in 2 comments. One, we don't need you, Mr. Firefighter, to determine who should be in our fire department. You are not the screening committee. You are not the longevity committee to see if you fit into our fire department, right? You're not the gatekeeper. We have standards to be the gatekeeper. We don't need your attitude to be the gatekeeper. We don't need your jokes and bullying to determine who should go further, who should graduate the academy and get promoted, et cetera. So I think if we don't have the lawsuits, then we wouldn't have these discussions. We wouldn't have the close calls. We wouldn't have this is why you need to. And unfortunately, some people need the hammer, right? And if you want your career to end because you harassed somebody or you discriminated or you're listed as the defendant in the lawsuit, you ain't getting hired anywhere, right? You're the problem. And is it worth your career? So here's my lesson. If we can't convince you through lawsuits, let's convince you through the internet. What you do will be all over the internet. If you don't stop it, if you think that you're the gatekeeper and that you need to show your justice to others, right? That, you shouldn't be in the fire service. Well, guess what? Your way of doing things is going to be, case number 101 on every website there is, and your career is over. Is it really worth it? So I hope lawsuits matter. I hope these discussions matter. I hope our lessons matter. We all love the fire service. We want to see it continue. And how else do we see it continue but for solving what's wrong with it? And we need to rip the Band-Aid off and talk about what's wrong with it. And I hope, I thank fire engineering for allowing us to have these types of conversations, because a lot of people in the fire service wouldn't, right? A lot of entities just wouldn't. And I will, only because I have the stage at the moment. I got to speak at the Fire and Women Conference, which was so much fun. And part of my topic was on discrimination, harassment at the firehouse, mostly quoting, Curt's stats. And they all came up to me after and said, great lecture, but you're preaching to the wrong choir. And I thought, yeah, how do we get people to listen? So maybe on our next show, we'll talk about that issue. How do we get people to listen? How do we get people to tune in literally and think about it? But for now, I want to thank Curt Varone, John Murphy, Chip Comstock, and myself, Brad Pinsky. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. I love having this live thing. John is going to get so much better internet. I mean, he got a new cell phone at one point. He'll probably going to get better internet now. So to hear this, and we thank you from all of us, and look forward to seeing you on the next edition of Fire Service Court video. I guess we are now. Thank you.